Good morning, ladies and gentlemen of the press, in person and virtual. Welcome to Idpada-G's press conference. In attendance today is Dr. Gittins, one of the crafters of the strategic plan of Idpada-G, and yours truly, Vincent Alexander, chairperson of Idpada-G. I will be reading the press statement, after which we are prepared to take questions on the press statement and any other Idpada-G related matter. Idpada-G has continued to pursue the goals of the decade within the limits of the resources available to us, in spite of government's continued withholding of our subvention without justifiable cause. Our robust participation at the recently held second session of the United Nations Permanent Forum for the People of African Descent in New York is evidence of our determination to stay the course. This government, on the other hand, has continued to wage a propaganda campaign against Idpada-G, including during its premier appearance at the UN meeting on issues related to African descendants. At this session of the Permanent Forum, the government of Guyana opted to send the Minister of Tourism and two members of the Ethnic Relations Commission, an entity that should be independent arbiters of ethnic relations. The government of Guyana has never fulfilled its obligation to implement the program for the decade, and consequently has never reported as the UN requires. Rather, it used its first appearance to attempt to debunk reports submitted to the UN by Idpada-G. Government's most recent piece of propaganda is a critical review of its Idpada-G's strategic plan, conducted by Joel Bendin under the aegis of SWIREX, Professional Services Incorporated, a project apparently sole source to them and assigned to Bendin. Bendin is better known for defending government policies and actions in the columns of the dailies. Given his pre-existing relationship and documented full-throated support for this government, one is left to wonder about the objectivity of his review, especially under the circumstances of a government's vicious attack and clear determination to destroy Idpada-G. Idpada-G has an unassailable reputation for accountability and transparency, as has been proven through our annual audits and the government's special investigative audit for the years 2018 to 2021. Yet, Bendin described the problem he intended to address as, quote, issues surrounding the organization's financial management and accountability. What issues? There's also public knowledge that for the said period, Idpada-G submitted its estimates inclusive of salary line items and was granted its subvention on that basis. There is no plausible basis for retrospective contentions pertaining to financial management. Bendin incorrectly stated that the government of Guyana disbursed funding directly to Idpada-G member organizations instead of Idpada-G. As of to date, no member organization has advised of the receipt of funds. Interestingly, and justifiably so, Bendin's review, including recommendations, do not address those issues. On the other hand, his review is a hodgepodge of inaccuracies, misrepresentations, omissions, half-truths, irrelevancies, and issues unrelated to the stated problem and the subject matter that he presents as the objective of his review. Bhagwandin makes the following assertions in his critique of the methodology used by the drafting team that need to be addressed. 1, inadequate sample. 2, hypothesis testing, research technique employed failed to test the validity of the hypothesis. The findings are generally based on the participants' perception rather than hardcore empirical evidence. And 3, focus on the economy. Discrimination by the state in the award of public contracts. Employment, factors responsible for high rates of unemployment among African Guyanese. And equity and equality, practices by other groups, including the state, that actively discriminate against African Guyanese. Sample and methodology. In his attempt to criticize the methodology employed by the developers of the strategic plan, he claimed that a survey method was used and that the sample size of 100 participants was inadequate. The crafters of the plan did not employ a quantitative approach or survey method. They used a qualitative, ethnographic, investigative approach of a multifaceted social dilemma where quantitative data, wherever available, was used to corroborate qualitative findings and enrich the understanding of the specific phenomena being experienced by people of African descent. The method of investigation included a desk review of historical documents and previous assessments, key informant interviews, and countrywide semi-structured focus groups with approximately 400 respondents. Hypothesis testing. No such was intended. The regional consultations and stakeholder meetings, so-called needs assessment, focused on 5 thematic sectoral areas, viz. Economy, employment, education, equity/equality, and expiation. These were conducted using a set of approximately 10 questions for each of the 5 areas that were intended to uniformly elicit the views and inputs of each community and stakeholder meeting, thereby ensuring comparability and aggregation, stroke collation. He totally ignores the sections on education and expiation. One wonders why. Focus on economy, where the crafters conducted a consultation under the rubric economy, inclusive of 17 group discussions. He claimed the total number of respondents was 17. His review, therefore, has no leg to stand on with regard to his contention that the methodology of the crafters of the plan was flawed. It is his understanding and representation that are deficient and therefore invalid as a basis for the analysis intended, thus nullifying his critical review. Bhagwandin's contention, such as the identification of statistics to show who applied for contracts and that the applicants were equally treated, does not address the historical and systemic disablement of some. That approach permeates Bhagwandin's claim that the African Guyanese community are on equal footing and not confronted with identifiable and remediable problems. Interestingly, he attempts to present data by ethnicity, although the Minister of Governance is on record playing ethnic data on the grounds of the collection of such data is in conflict with the Constitution. Content of the report. As already stated, Bhagwandin's review does not address the problem which he articulated. And to reference other countries as he did that are dissimilar to Guyana, is no basis for suggesting the course of action to be taken in Guyana. His stated objective, and I quote, is to examine the issues surrounding the dispute between Idpada-G and the government of Guyana, end of quote. To wit, the unresolved dispute between Idpada-G and the government of Guyana. He, however, engages in an excursion under the following heads: economy, decision-making, employment, equity and equality, and does not address the so-called dispute. In that excursion, Bendin embraces a disposition that exemplifies a fundamental point of departure between Idpada-G and the government, and clearly infers the difference between Idpada-G and the government with regard to the problem that necessitated the declaration of the decade. Idpada-G understands the decade to be a project aimed at addressing and correcting the impact of the institutional and legal frameworks and structures established by the colonial powers and maintained by successor states that have inhibited or retarded the recognition, justice, and development of the people of African descent. Such redress and correction requires reparatory, corrective, and equitable actions. The current government operates from the premise that once the current system is not discriminatory on the surface or in itself an inhibitor, then there is no need for reparations, correction, and equitable measures. That flies in the face of the fact that there can be no equality if the contestants are not equally prepared and positioned. Hence, the need for the people of African descent, who, for example, were forced off of their lands and into paid employment, to be treated equitably, to enable them to be equalized with those whose agricultural and commercial pursuits were facilitated when the people of African descent were inhibited and continue to be inhibited due to the head start of others. Recommendations. In some regards, Bendin concedes that there are problems unrelated to the one he identified as the subject of his review, although he could not address it for the want of evidential material. However, his recommendations are misconceived. He agreed that the government must take immediate steps to conform to the objectives of the decade, but does not recognize nor concede that Idpada-G's repeated calls upon the government for talks was intended to initiate those steps. In that regard, the president failed to fulfill 3 promises to meet. His suggestion that the Commission of African Guyanese Organizations be established to determine and facilitate the needed actions is mischievous and disrespectful. Idpada-G is an authentic organization, African Guyanese organizations, that emerged at the behest of and funded by the government of Guyana. It has also studied the problem and proffered solutions using a bottom-up approach. All that's required is for the government to acknowledge the plight of the people of African descent, the raison d'etre for the decade, and to speak to the authentic representatives of the people of African descent. That's the statement. We're now prepared to take your questions on this statement and on related Idpada-G matters.
What invested in when will
I have not been officially advised of this review. The document came to our attention through an article carried in the Chronicle newspapers. We are led to assume that this review resulted from reports we had made to the United Nations. And in the review itself, he refers to some 100-page response to the United Nations, as well as yet another attempt by the government to discredit Idpada-G and to give good reason for the actions that they continue to take against Idpada-G.
Let's say, based on what you've read, that's the understanding of the issue between Idpada-G and the government. Mr. Martin reached out to the organization.
He did not. He did not.
And the strategic plan to which you reference to that is from that is probably the conceptualization that is recent there, or is this a fresh document?
No, it is the original strategic plan which was developed for Idpada-G.
And you also said based on information Idpada-G does not know if there were any person who was direct funds. They find out that given the issue with subvention and the government not giving it Idpada-G, the attempts to have it given to some. I'm sure. But could you say if that is what you're referencing to where you say we don't have any knowledge?
Yes, that's what we are referencing. In the first instance, Bendin incorrectly suggests in his report that organizations have been recipients of funding from the government. Our information is that no organization, even though they submitted project documents, have been in receipt of funding from the government. Go ahead, let's hear it. Adam Harris, you can proceed with your question.
Yes, sorry, I didn't hear the invitation. A very good morning, everyone. Sir, you spoke of the Bendin review. How was that review related to the government's presentation at the United Nations? That's the first one. And what kind of a reaction did your presentation to the United Nations receive, sir, at that particular forum? Did you hear me, sir?
Yes, I've heard you. The Bendin report is far more extensive than the government's presentation at the United Nations. The government's presentation at the United Nations was done by 3 persons, 2 of them from the Ethnic Relations Commission, and by Minister Wolverine, the Minister of Tourism. All that they sought to do in those presentations, particularly the minister and the chairperson of the Ethnic Relations Commission, Mr. Hack, was to suggest that there were no issues in Guyana in relation to the people of African descent and how they were being treated in the decade. And that, in fact, the government had policies and programs that gave access to all Guyanese for all things equally. That's essentially what they sought to see at the United Nations, and to indicate that what Idpada-G would have been reporting was therefore not accurate. In the press statement, we've made the point that there are 2 different perspectives in relation to how the issue is seen. we see the issue from a perspective of historical wrongs based on institutional and legal arrangements and the continuation, in a sense, of those historical wrongs through the continued existence of those institutions and legal frameworks. Their position is that there's no need to look at the historical situation. We have a society where there's equal opportunity, and therefore the people of African descent are in no different position from others. They completely ignore the history, and in fact, the history which informs the United Nations in arriving at the declaration of the decade after a number of conferences highlighted by the Durban Conference in particular, that sought to address the historical wrongs that need to be redressed. I would say that the United Nations is paying keen attention to the reports of Idpada-G, and it's for that reason that Bendin is caused to say that the government had to render a 100-page response to the issues which were raised by Idpada-G. As far as we know, this matter of getting clarity on these issues is an ongoing process at the level of the United Nations.
The next question I want to ask, sir. The question of the subvention went to arbitration, sir. What has been the outcome of that arbitration, sir?
The question of subvention never really went to arbitration. The judge did suggest that we can have voluntary mediation. We agreed to that, but it turned out that the government never engaged us in mediation. They primarily said in the exchange we had what was their disposition. And there was no discussion that involved an attempt to mediate. The matter, therefore, returned to the court, unmediated. The court has since received the submissions of the parties, both written and oral submissions, has sought clarity in terms of those submissions, and we now await the judgment of the court.
So I know that Dr. Giddings, you said that was facilitated or formed part of the team that crafted the strategic strategy. If he could allude to the importance of that strategy and how Idpada-G has been able to implement it over the years would be helpful.
Thank you for your question. And good morning, everyone. The first chance to say good morning to you all formally. On the strategy itself, and in fact, I will go back perhaps very briefly to a question you'd asked before, which I don't think we had addressed, and that is when was the strategy prepared? And just note that this was six motives. Great entrepreneurs and persons who are engaged in providing services in that area, whether it be as contractors or what. So that was something done in just preparing persons of African descent to actually engage and be better positioned to provide services and in fact find their place in the economy. They've also been support for a number of economic activities at the community level And again, there's the range of activities in terms of agriculture, craft, etc. I don't have all the details, but Vincent, I'm sure will provide that. But that's been done. In terms of other areas, for example, education, there's been training for persons to prepare them better for employment. There'd be training I think in languages also. I remember that you had that in 2020 or thereabouts, African languages, etc. There's also been work done with cultural organizations in terms of, and this is the plank of the strategic plan that speaks to education, meaning or re-education of people in terms of the African history and culture, etc. That from which the persons of African descent they find their being. So a number of things have been done in that regard, and the plan is being implemented. I know the annual subvention, up to the point when you received it, I should say, that was used in many ways to support the activities under the 5 or 6 areas, so to speak, because there's also been a lot of capacity building of the Idpada-G organizations, etc., or Idpada-G member organizations, I should say. So basically, that's in a nutshell some of the activities that have been implemented. There have been many more. I believe these are on the website and elsewhere, and Vincent, I'm sure the Secretary can make that available on request.
Yeah, but I would like to augment what you said, by specifying the work we did with the youth exposed, the youth business exposed that we had, and the youth investor funds, where we attempted to get the youths involved in business activities and actually awarded the youths who did good business pitches of things that they were actually doing. So we did engage the youth in that regard. I think special mention also should be made of our Ujama, where we brought together vendors, particularly in the area of craft and the creative arts, in exhibitions, having done with them training in relation to packaging, advertising, and marketing their goods. What's so important to note, however, if one looks at the strategic plan, one would see that there's a number of areas that required state intervention. And this, in many regards, is also in keeping with what the United Nations specified. In that regard, Idpada-G embarked on a process of preparing itself to make a representation to the government, to have them undertake the things that required state intervention. Because once you talk about institutional issues and legal frameworks and things like that, then those are not things that an organization can do on its own. Those are things that require state intervention. As I said earlier, the United Nations actually, in its objectives and in its goals, specify the role of the state. And so we prepared and were at the point in July of last year, I think it was, ready to engage the government. And that is the reason why we wrote to President Ali to engage the government so that we can share with them and motivate them and inspire them and request them to do what is required of the government. Unfortunately, we've never had those exchanges with the government. President Ali has promised on 3 occasions to do so. He's never been responsive in terms of actually engaging us. And what we saw instead was an avalanche coming from the vice president, trying to criticize and denigrate Idpada-G. And that is what we have gotten from the government, rather than the exchanges we were looking for. That could have served a number of purposes. If they had problems, the exchanges could have helped to discuss what were the problems and how they could be resolved. But our intention really was, here is the need for state action we have done work in terms of determining what kinds of actions we thought were desirable through our preparation of the strategic plan and various consultations. Here we laying it out to you, the government, looking forward to a response from the government in that regard. And we've got no response. What we've gotten is hostility rather than response. One other thing I should add is that the government has a reporting responsibility to the United Nations. They did not attend the first working group session in Geneva. They did not attend the first session of the permanent unit in Geneva, and only attended the second session of the permanent unit in New York, primarily in a sense to defend and to respond to the work that we had been doing in the reports that we had been submitted. However, it should be noted that prior to 2020, Idpada-G did have meetings with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in keeping with the need for the government to report on the work that was being done. So the Ministry of Foreign Affairs was the ministry that relates to the United Nations. And so Idpada-G did on a number of occasions meet with that ministry to report on the work that we were doing. And in fact, to use that ministry as a conduit to get the government itself to engage us in certain, to be engaged in certain activities.
If no one is there asking, sir, because I can't really hear them, can I ask what is the state of your legal action against Vice President Jagdeo, sir?
My lawyer only today advised me that trying to err on the side of caution, that this matter does not fall off of the court's agenda, that there was a recent management meeting on this matter. So the matter was filed, we made our submissions. Mr. Jagdeo had responded to those submissions. It's now a question of the actual hearing in court. A date has not been set. The judge has merely promised that in relatively short order they will do it. Are there any other questions?
Yes,
Virtual
sir.
or?
Yes, sir. There is another question. It's almost 2 years since you received your last subvention, but you are still undertaking work, although at a reduced level from what you were doing before, sir. What kind of a support are you getting from outside of Guyana to help you to maintain your operation, sir? And generally, what has been the international reaction from organizations not necessarily favorable to Idpada-G, but organizations that have been paying an interest to what is happening in Guyana vis-a-vis Idpada-G, sir?
We have gotten support from the diaspora, Guyanese in the diaspora, and organizations in the diaspora. What we have sought to do is to develop various projects and go out into the arena of funding for non-governmental organizations with those projects to access funds. We have had the opportunity overseas to have what may be referred to as side events That is, when the group of experts meet, we are able to organize an event that is not on their agenda, but facilitated by the gathering. And so we've had two side events, one in Geneva, and they were virtual as well, and one in New York, where we have been able to reach out beyond Guyana to the wider global community to inform them of the situation here in Guyana, with particular reference to the situation Idpada-G finds itself in and the people of African descent have found themselves in. It is in that regard that some people have come forward, individuals and organizations, to lend us monetary assistance, as well as to partner with us in the search for funds. I must say that at the international level, Idpada-G has been recognized more or less as a model organization because no other country has done it the way we have done it. And so we have been recognized as a model organization, and other countries have been speaking to us and consulting with us in terms of how we've gone about our work, the model that we have adopted in their own efforts to do something in their own countries.
And if nobody else, just one last question. From my perspective, the government seems to be treating Idpada-G as an opposition political party. Has Idpada-G seen this situation in the same light? And if that is the case, do you see the need for a political solution to what is happening now, sir?
Idpada-G is an organization that seeks to represent the interests of people of African descent. By virtue of that, Idpada-G cannot be a political organization because the people of African descent are not necessarily of one political disposition or orientation. We are open to all people of African descent, and the positions that Idpada-G takes are positions that are bottom up. They are determined by the assembly of Idpada-G, which is the coming together of the organizations through their representatives, so that in the common understanding of what politics is, Idpada-G is not involved in politics. We, however, recognize that the extent to which our narrative about the problem and its solutions are different to the narrative of the government is the extent to which the current government seeks to present a picture of Idpada-G being political, which can partly be associated with the fact that some of the things that we would be calling for are things that political parties might also be calling for. And that's just a matter of coincidence. It's not a matter of collaboration. It's a matter of coincidence. The government has said on a previous occasion that we have sought to require funds to be engaged in a political campaign towards the 2020 elections. I challenge the government. I challenge the government to identify one activity disposition to controlling all of the space in this country, be it political or otherwise. In this instance, space occupied by a non-governmental organization. I sense that there are no other questions. Dr. Gittins, would you like to have a final word? If there are no other questions, thank you very much for your attendance. We do look forward to the ongoing work of your estate.